And as per normal, welcome back everybody, and today we are going to talk about the Persian Empire. This is another one of my favorites, right up there with the Maya, so let's just get right into it because it's exciting. Yes, many of you have seen the 300, and it's just terrible. I mean, as a film, it was probably fun and lots of action and blood if you're into that. And of course, it's a rated R film, so I don't suggest that you see it. But yeah, a lot of it really wasn't right, kind of at all whatsoever. So yeah, let's just forget everything we learned in that and let's really learn about the real Persians. Okay, the Persians, they really are from modern day Iran, and that's what the people who live in Iran primarily are. You can call them Iranian, you can call them Persian, do not call them Arab because they're not. They are a Indo-European group, and as you can see, they were down from from this area right here. Okay, this is modern day Iran, and much of their history they were dominated by another Indo-European group, the Medes, and then after the Medes, you also had the Babylonians. And the ancient Persians were actually pastoralists. They were herders, primarily herding cattle. Over time, they start to herd horses. And of course, we know what people are really good at when they have horses. And from the horses, then they're able to slowly but surely get organized. And really, what you ended up needing with the Persians, they needed a leader. And that leader was Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus the Great is one of the few guys in history that, you could really call him the Great because he was great. He started the Achaemenid dynasty. He was the king from 558 to 530, and he was a fantastic military leader. It is this man that is the founder of the Persian Empire, which would be really the greatest land-based empire perhaps in history. You probably would have to get all the way to Russia in the 50s, 60s, 70s to have an empire that was as strong as them based on the land. Now, you could also have the Mongols, but the Mongols kind of broke up pretty quick. And as John Green said, they're the exception to that rule anyway. But he was an incredible leader. He first conquers the Medes, then he conquers Babylon, and then he just goes on a tear. If you see here, by about 540 BCE, about 10 years before his death, he is able to conquer a remarkable amount of land. You're looking at the area from Anatolia, which I'll talk about more later, all the way to modern day Pakistan. You here see Gandhara, that's modern day Kandahar. So this really is an absolutely incredible size. And if that was all he did, we'd probably still talk about him today. But there's a lot more. Pasargadae is the city that he built. And really, the Babylonians start this, but then the Persians will pick it up in this idea of just building fantastic cities. And if you don't have a fantastic capital city, you like almost don't count. And as you can see here, the picture of the right from our reconstruction of Pasargadae is absolutely incredible. I mean, you look how beautiful it is and have rivers around it. Of course, the modern day desert has kind of infringed upon it because over here is what is left. So really this wonderful, beautiful capital. Here's why Cyrus is so crazy, if you will, is that he ruled an empire based on tolerance. Slavery was actually relatively uncommon, and slaves were actually could have really good positions, believe it or not. But here's the deal: when Cyrus conquered you, as a people, you had a tremendous amount of rights. You would not be persecuted. You would not be removed. It's not the Assyrians coming in and killing everybody. It's not the Babylonians coming in and then removing everybody. He's a guy that allowed you to worship your gods and basically allowed you to rule yourself. As long as you didn't cause an uprising or and paid your taxes, they left you alone. And he believed in employing people from across his empire. You could go to work with the Persians. I mean, you had to be a Persian to be in the ruling class, but they would employ you if you were good. And really, to give you an idea of the most, or the biggest thing he did, it, if you remember, it was Cyrus that allowed the captive Jews to return to Israel and reestablish their lives there. He's talked about in the Bible. He's one of the few actual kings that we know existed that are talked about in the Bible. And some Jews of the day actually thought Cyrus was the Messiah because he brought them home and perhaps saved them from extinction. So, this idea of, yes, he was a conqueror, and yes, he did kill people, and ultimately he would die in battle, but this idea of let's not persecute everybody, let's give people actual rights. This was incredible, and this was done by Cyrus. This was not the Persians that you saw that were depicted in the 300 as slave drivers and stuff like that. These were an enlightened people that believed in all people and their right to live. Now, unfortunately, when you are a general and you fight a lot, you have a hazard, and that hazard is death. In the year 530, Cyrus dies in battle in modern-day Turkey. He would be succeeded by his son, and here in what is left of Pasargadae, you have his tomb. And for such a great man, so simple. Some of the later tombs would be really impressive, like when I show you, say, that of Xerxes or something along that line. But real simple. Of course, it was looted and plundered, but we actually have, his temple, or not his temple, his tomb. And so, really, one of the key figures in history, and the Persians would be one of the most accomplished groups in the history of the world, and it was Cyrus who started it all. Cyrus would then be succeeded by his son Cambyses, who, if you follow the arrows on the bottom here, okay, he went into Egypt, he conquered this area, what was left of the Babylonian Empire. He didn't conquer any of this because, well, it was mostly desert and there wasn't much there to conquer, luckily enough for the Arabs. And he also mysteriously sent a army into northern Africa that disappeared and no one knows what happened to it. He got down, if you look below Egypt, he got down to modern-day Kush and supposedly tried to attack the Kushites but was unable to defeat them. But now under Cambyses, the empire is now at its largest state. Unfortunately for Cambyses, he also did die early, and he died without a son to take over, and unfortunately he died getting on a horse. Yes, that's right, getting on a horse. Hey, in history, wacky things happen, and it looks like he had a spear in his hand, was getting on his horse and slipped, and he speared himself, and he bled out and died. Some people in the future try to write about possible assassination or something else, quote-unquote, funny that happened, but the fact of the matter is this dude was clumsy, and he killed himself. It's very unfortunate, but nonetheless it happened. Perhaps the greatest of the leaders was Darius III, not Darius, Darius, or Darius the Great. Darius became known as the Shah, the King of Kings, because that was the idea. When they conquered areas, they would let the king kind of be, like a subject king, and he would carry out the wishes of the Persians. And as a result, he gets one of my favorite titles of all time, the Shah, the King of Kings. It's really cool. If you look at his empire, I mean, it's just gigantic. It's 1,865 miles long. It's 983 miles wide. If you're looking at it here, you can see it's just absolutely gigantic. And nonetheless, if you look here, it says the Empire of Alexander. I have it on the bottom. The reason I use this map was, one, we're going to talk about him in the future, but if you take this area off of here, okay, this is what Alexander conquered, and this was the Persian Empire, okay? And we need to understand just how freakishly large this is, and it was under Darius that it reached its greatest height. The first thing he built, of course, was a huge city, Persepolis. This was one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. The picture on the top, you can see what was left. The picture on the bottom, you can see what it looked like. It was filled with palaces, and It was filled with workshops for craftsmen. It was filled with areas for people to trade and bazaars and malls, if you will. It was filled with gardens, and it was just absolutely beautiful. What happened to it? Alexander the Great got drunk when he conquered it and burned it to the ground. We'll talk about it later. The other big thing that Darius was really focused on was public works. Here you see a Persian garden. Um, Being a gardener was actually considered to be one of the greatest types of occupations you could have. So you see them all over the place. They would build gardens and roads and things for people. What was really impressive was his government organization. Okay, basically the setup that you see in our country today and every large empire for the future was done by the Persians. You can see there all those little pieces of Persia, and they are called satrapies. And the satrapies would be led by a satrap. Okay, so the satrap or governor may actually be a person that was former of the what's the word I want to use? It was the former king or ruler of that area. Some of the areas, if you look, actually still bear names today, particularly if you look up here, Armenia, Assyria would eventually become Syria, Egyptos is still Egypt, Libya, that would of course become Libya. So you see, and using the phrase India for one of the first times. Okay, and here is your modern day Iran. And the governor would rule for the Shah. The Shah also had a secret service, if you will, or his eyes and ears. These were spies that made sure everything could be done, and they were actually also many times slaves. They would standardize coinage and weights and measures. Yes, the king or the Shah would decree what would happen, but then that would be carried out by everybody. And this is how you can have an empire this freakishly huge because it is organized. The other big thing is that they built roads everywhere, and the most impressive was the Royal Road. If you can see here, this brown line from right here all the way through, this is a road that was 1,600 miles long and went from the coast of Turkey, or Sardis was the city, all the way to Susa and then eventually on to Persepolis. The Persians could get you anywhere. It was said a man on a kind of Pony Express type situation that they had could travel this in 2 weeks. A well-trained army could take it in about a month. It was a way that they could keep order. It was a way that they fostered trade and the spread of ideas, and it really influenced particularly the Romans. The idea is that you build these roads, this connects the empire so information can travel and your army can travel, and boom, you've got incredible civilization. What did that also lead to? Hey, trade and commerce. Persia itself was agricultural based. They had peas and lentils and garlic, and you see all the wonderful foods there. And from there, they would then build these roads and spread out. What did you get? These trade routes. You can see different types of metal and other things that were around there, but you can see that trade went from India all the way into Anatolia. Eventually, it went into Greece and to Egypt as well. It was an incredible sea route. They also went through the Red Sea, and it would just develop this trade, and it would prove to be one of the bases of the Silk Roads, which we'll be talking about in the future. But this type of empire, it needs lots of money. It's right in the middle of everything. And really what you end up happening is you do have eventually goods from China will travel through what was left of Persia and eventually get to Rome. And it was because the Persians set it up this way. And this just gives you an idea of what we're trading. I mean, just absolutely incredible. And you see all these things. I want you to read through these. This is stuff that you absolutely need to know. You need to know what's going where. The interesting thing that you have here is that you have the development of also the high-end or the luxury trade. Gold, mirrors, jewelry, specific dyes, ebony and ivory, papyrus, which is early paper. So you're getting the high-end trade. So it is the wealthy that are looking for these goods, but regular people like you and me are involved because we're the ones that are working the trade. We're the merchants and things along that line. And so now you're going to really get the development of what, in many cases, we call the middle class, these merchants who can travel everywhere. And again, we go back to the Persians for it. But the most important thing that moves are ideas, and we have to talk about this a lot. Religion, science, technology, mathematics, all of this stuff is going to move along these routes and then eventually along the Silk Roads, which I said we'll talk to. We're going to have a religion called Zoroastrianism. We're going to see Christianity eventually move along this way. We will see Islam will move along these lines. And all of this is so crucial, and the Persians just really showed us how it was done. Eventually, all good things must come to an end, and it first starts with the first king Xerxes. There'll be two that just start spending way too much money. And here's an example. That's his tomb. He found a mountain and just had it carved out. It cost ridiculous amounts of money, and it really started to stress his empire. This trade was slowing down, and eventually it's going to be war. War with two groups of people, the Greeks and eventually the Macedonians. It starts in 490 when the Ionian Greeks in Anatolia or modern-day Turkey will revolt. And they revolted because the Athenians convinced the Ionians that the Persians were a bunch of barbarians, which they weren't. And so Darius felt that he had to send them a message and would travel to Greece to try to defeat them. The problem is this was really far from home, and the Greeks were able to rally, defeat the Persians at Marathon and a couple of other battles, and drive them back. Darius pledged that he would come back. This is Darius II, but that would go to his son. So the first Greek war was lost by Darius II, and the second would be led by Xerxes II. And Xerxes realized that the Greeks were way better than the Persians in the water. So they decided to build one of the most incredible things, and I got to show you this, a bridge across the Black Sea or the Bosporus Strait connecting Asia to Europe. The bridge was 1.5 miles long, guys. 2,500 years ago, they built a 1.5 mile long bridge, and it was a pontoon bridge. Okay, what they did is they lined up a bunch of boats, they connected them with cables, they put planking and gravel down that would allow horses to cross, and they walked from Asia to Europe. And they built two bridges, one to go forward and one to go back. It's mind-boggling, and it really shows you what they were. The problem is that the Greeks, unfortunately, were ready for them. For the Persians, it ended up that the Greeks were better soldiers. You have the famous Battle of Thermopylae, in which the Greeks were able to hold off the Persian advance that had not been defeated for a while, and this is where we get the 300 from. And the only thing that was right about the 300 is that they slowed up the Persians and all the Spartans died. After that, it's done. But then the Greeks were able to rally and defeat the Persians at both the battles of Salamis and later the Battle of Plataea. And it really just weakened them militarily. And the Persians returned home for about a century and were really just focusing on kind of their internal trade, stabilizing their economy. But unfortunately for them, there was a guy by the name of Alexander the Great who in 330 BCE decided to conquer them. And the fact of the matter is he's probably the greatest, if not one of the greatest generals that has ever lived. And there's no real actual evidence that he ever lost a battle. This is a famous painting that was actually found in Pompeii of Alexander the Great attacking Darius III. And it is Alexander that will bring down the great Persian Empire. But not suffice to say, the Persian Empire was incredible. Their technology, their trade, their belief in tolerance and acceptance of all peoples, much against the 300 and what that said about them. And it was the Persian empires that would allow this exchange of knowledge from east to west to flourish. and it would really change tremendous things in the future. And we'll talk about how they influenced the Romans, because even after these Persians fall, there would be successors. We're going to talk about the Parthenids and the Sassanids and the Seleucids, and people that just tried to keep doing what the Persians started in 558 BCE under Cyrus. So an incredible civilization, and one we really should know more about. All right, so same thing last time. Let's get a comment on the YouTube page and 5 questions for tomorrow. I'll see you guys later.